All right, welcome in. Today we'll be talking about the three common lookup formulas in Excel. So we'll go over the VLookup, the XLookup, the HLookup, and then I'll throw in a bonus if-errors statement. As always, the data link is going to be down below if you would like to work on it while you're following along. Otherwise, you can work on it on your own later if you'd like to. Without further ado, let's get started. So we will start first with the most common of the lookups, which is the VLookup. So the VLookup is a formula that returns a unique value based on criteria within a data set. This is good formula for data sets that are set up vertically, meaning that the headers are across the top of the data and then all the data is vertically below. So for example, this data set's perfect. We have our employee by role, by region, by last name, by hire date, and then by tenure with all the data points down below. So starting in column I2, we'll start our first lookup formula. As you can see, we want to look up the hire date based off of the employee. So for Alice Johnson, we want it to return her hire date and then so on and so forth. So we'll start in column I2 and we will put equals and we'll type out VLookup parenthesis. Now Excel gives us the pieces of the formula which we have to input. So the first piece is going to be the lookup value. So we know we want to find the employee in the data set. So we'll highlight Alice Johnson in H2 and then we will put a comma. Now the second piece is going to be the table array. So a table array for a lookup formula is going to be the data starting with the criteria range all the way over to our output range. So for example, our criteria range is employee, so we want to start with the employee column, and our output is going to be the hire date. So we'll drag the range all the way over to column E. So that's going to be our table array, A through E. Then comma to move on to the next one. The way that a VLookup works is it's going to look up how many columns are between the criteria column, which is our employee, and the output column, which is the hire date. So the next piece is going to be this column index number, which is just a simple term for how many columns are between the two. So starting with column A, we'll count these. So between the employee and the hire date, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So our column index number is going to be 5. And then we will put a comma. And the last piece of this formula, it gives us the option between true and false. So true, we'll go over this later, why this isn't really the most appropriate choice to use, whereas false is probably what you'll want to use most of the time. So we'll type false. And then it gives us the hire date. So you see Alice Johnson, her hire date is December 11th, 2011. And then we'll either drag or double click this formula down. As you can see, Nathan Lewis, it returns a error here. So that is because we put false here. So basically what the false is doing is it's showing that if Excel cannot find the exact value, so if they cannot find Nathan Lewis in the employee column, then give us an error. Now, if we change this false to true, type true, push enter, Excel does this weird thing where it gives you an approximation, which isn't necessarily accurate because Nathan's not in here at all. It's just approximating his hire date. So we don't want to see an approximation. We just want to see if it's truly there or not. So we'll continue to use false for that. Okay, so that concludes the VLookup. Only criteria for a VLookup to actually work is it needs to have the columns in order. So the criteria range needs to be in front of the output. So for example, if we wanted to look up a last name and return a row, we couldn't make the range go backwards. So in this instance, this is where we would use an XLookup. So we'll move on to the XLookup tab. So an XLookup, just like a VLookup, returns a unique value based off of a criteria within a data set. It's also good for the vertically set up data sets. So like we saw before, the headers are in the first row here, and then all the data is below it. But the difference between an XLookup and a VLookup is that an XLookup, it doesn't matter what order the columns are in. Whereas a VLookup, the criteria column has to be in front of the output column. So let's look at an XLookup. So starting in column K2 here, we want to look up the employee, or we want to see what, based off of the employee, what region they're in. So let's start here. We'll do equals, and then we'll do XLookup, parenthesis. Okay, so just like a VLookup, we want to select the lookup value. Okay, so we want to look up our employee, comma, and then we want to look up the lookup array. So instead of highlighting the whole thing like we did a VLookup, we want to look up the lookup array. So in layman's terms, it's going to be the criteria column. So Alice Johnson is our criteria. So our criteria column will be the employee column, comma, and then our return array. So we want it to return region. So we'll highlight the region column. Okay. And then this one doesn't really require you to put anything in after that. You don't have to put a true or a false in. So we'll just close the parenthesis and it will return for us the region the employee's in. So we'll drag it down. As you can see, it'll give us that error again that we like to see if they're not within the range. So this formula, the XLookup, is actually a little bit easier to use if you're not sure which columns, or if you don't want to end up counting all the column rows, or if you're not sure if they're in the same order. It's kind of an improvement on the VLookup. So this is, generally easier to use than the VLookup, but there are instances where you're going to find the VLookup to be a little bit easier. All right, so say we don't have a vertical data set, because remember the VLookup and XLookup are kind of good formulas for those kind of data sets, but what if we don't have a vertical data set? Say we have a data set where the headers are in the column, so along the side, and all the data is horizontally spread out across all the columns following the header columns. So this is a horizontal data set. So this is where we would use an HLookup. So as you can guess, this means horizontal lookup. This returns a unique value based off of a criteria in a data set, just like a VLookup and an XLookup, except this one is specifically for those horizontal data sets. So starting in column B15 down here, we want to look up employee. We want to look up the region for each employee. So we will type in HLookup. Okay. Now, just like the other two lookups, it requires the lookup value. So we'll highlight Alice Johnson, and then we'll do a comma. Now for this one, we want to look up the table array just like a VLookup, but we want to start with the row that the criteria is in. So we'll start with the employee row, and we want to look up region. So we'll drag down to here. Now on this one, we want to make sure that we're locking this as we drag down the formulas. So F4 puts this lock on the table array. So it'll put these little dollar signs between the 1 and the 3 here. So that's just locking it for us. I'll show you what that looks like if we don't lock it. So we'll put a comma there now that we have our table array. And just like the VLookup, we want to count how many rows are between the criteria column and the output column. So starting with employee, we have 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows is the region column. So we'll put 3, and then we will put a comma, and then just like the VLookup, we want to put false and enter. Okay. So then we'll drag this formula down, and as you can see, it'll return based off of the horizontal lookup what region each employee is in. Now, remember how I said we would lock the formulas? If we did not lock the formulas, if we did not click F4 and we simply just left the range like this, and we drag the formulas down, you'll see there's a bunch of errors being returned. Now that's because the range moves. So every time we drag the formula down, it moves down one column. So that's why we put that F4 in there, or those dollar signs, to lock that range. So now the range is just locked on the first 3 rows. All right. So those are your 3 lookups. Now for the bonus, as promised, let's move on to if errors. Okay, so we'll use this formula alongside a VLookup formula. So an if errors is an add-on formula that will either return a 0 or another value that you designate other than that NA or error value. So for example, we'll start with column L2. We'll want to look up employee and tenure. So we'll do equals. Now, before we do the lookup formula, we will type in if error. Okay, and then parenthesis. And then we will start our VLookup. So it's kind of embedded within this if errors. Okay, so if errors first, and then in between is going to be the VLookup. So we'll do our VLookup. So we'll look up Alice Johnson, and we'll look up the employee row, and we want to return tenure. So we'll drag over the array to tenure, comma, and then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So we'll put the 5 as the column index number, and then we will put false here. Okay, and then close the parenthesis. Now we have our VLookup, but we have to finish the if error formula. So we'll put a column, or I'm sorry, we'll put a comma here, and then instead of that error value, that NA value, we want it to say not found. So we'll put a quotation, and we'll put not found, and then we'll put an end quotation, and then an end parenthesis. All right, and then enter. So everything will look the same until we get to Nathan Lewis, because we know he's not in the data set. So it will return this not bound. So it'll be right in our face that he is not in this data set. All right, so that concludes our lookup session. If you liked this or found this useful, please follow and subscribe. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.